From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I first met Neil at this festival 7 years ago. He came here just as one of you to see the festival with his daughter Maddie. And we'd corresponded. I'd reviewed American Gods, and we met, became friends. And he's now graced us as one of our most distinguished and popular speakers for 2 or 3 years now. I hardly think I need to introduce Neil Gaiman to most of you. He is one of the most versatile writers of our time, being a master of the graphic novel, of the novel in general, of children's books, movie scripts, even translations for Japanese movies into English. He's a man of many parts. We are, in fact, fellow members of the Baker Street Irregulars, a Sherlock Holmes group. I'm always astonished at the versatility and genius that he brings to almost anything he undertakes. So it is with great pleasure I introduce to you this morning and into the afternoon, Neil Gaiman.
Thank you. The last times I've come here, I've explained what was going to happen. This time I've made no plans, so nothing can possibly go wrong. We have half an hour-ish, and I'll do some reading, questions and answers, I guess. How does that sound? Okay. So, this is the Graveyard book. It is not released until Tuesday. It comes out on September the 30th. It has a one-day laydown, which means that all over America, people in bookshops know that they are not allowed to bring the copies out and put them on the shelves until Tuesday. Nobody is allowed to have one of these except you lot. And because I pointed out it would be rather silly if I came out to them all 3 days before my book came out and we weren't allowed to sell them. So people were spoken to and rules were broken, and we do have copies here. This is the book that took me the longest to write. Mostly, people say to me, where did you get the idea for such and such a book? And the only real answer I can give them is, I have no idea, I don't remember. I wasn't paying attention. And they say, okay, Coraline. The thing that freaked me out in Coraline was the buttons for eyes. Where did you get the idea of having people with buttons for eyes? And I go, I don't know. I didn't think it was going to be important. It was just an idea. But this one, I actually know. It was 23 and a little bit years ago, and I was living in Sussex in a very, very tall house above a shop. And it was a very tall, very thin house, which meant that every single room was on a different floor. And you got from floor to floor by stairs. And I had an 18, 19-month-old son who had a little tricycle. And obviously, he couldn't ride the tricycle in the house because he would die. Which meant that every day I would carry him and his tricycle down the stairs. But we didn't have a garden. There was no garden. Instead, I would walk him across the lane to a churchyard filled with big old gravestones, and many of them going back 700, 800, 900 years, and I would watch him happily pedal his tricycle around the graveyard. And I remember sitting there watching him, going, and I thought one day, you know, he looks really at home here. Whoever thought a small boy would look so at home in a graveyard? And then I thought, you know, you could take the basic idea of Kipling's The Jungle Book, of a boy who is orphaned and brought up, wanders into the jungle and is brought up by animals and taught all the things that animals know. And you could sort of slide it over into a graveyard. And you could have an orphan boy who wanders into a graveyard, adopted by dead people, and brought up and taught all the things that dead people know. What a great idea. And I was really enthusiastic, and I went up to the little office. I was a working journalist at that point, and I'd written and sold some short stories, and I sat down and I started to write the Graveyard Book. And I wrote about a page and a half, and I looked at it and I thought, this is a better idea than I am a writer. I am not good enough for this one yet, so I will put it off. And that's what I did. And every 5 or 6 years, I'd write a page of the Graveyard Book, and I'd look at it, and I'd go, that's rubbish, and throw it away, and decide to wait until I was a better writer. And somewhere about 4 or 5 years ago, I thought, I'm not getting any better. For good or for ill, I am probably now as good a writer as I am going to be. I may as well write that thing. So I started with chapter 4 this time. Having always tried to write chapter 1 scenes, I thought chapter 4, it'll be in the middle, because I'd already decided it was going to be a novel that was going to be built from short stories, and each one was going to happen 2 years apart. So chapter 4, he'd be about 8 years old. And I started chapter 4, and I wrote about 3 pages of it, and had just got to the point of deciding it was rubbish when my daughter Maddie wandered past and said, what are you writing? And I said, well, I'll read it to you. And I read it to her. And she said, what happens next? And suddenly, which is the question that is very dangerous to ask writers, because suddenly I could no longer go, oh, it's rubbish, I'm putting it away. Suddenly I had somebody who cared. So I finished the story. I thought I would read you today a little bit from quite late in the book. My plan for the coming next couple of weeks is I'm doing a tour that is not going to be a signing tour. I'm signing today. I will start at 3. I will go on probably until they take the tent apart around me, which was what they did 3 years ago, the last time I was here. And I will try and sign for everybody, but I'm not going to be doing that on the tour. What I'm planning to do on the tour is read, do questions and answers, and at every stop, I'm going to do a whole chapter. So I thought I'd give myself a little bit here from late in the book, because I'm not going to get to this bit again until I get to, I think it's Boulder, Colorado, or somewhere on the tour. So Bod is, this is actually from quite late in the book. We're in chapter 7. Bod is about 14 years old, and he's trying to figure a few things out, and pretty much all of his friends are dead. So he's going to one of them for advice. Bod was making his way through the northwest quadrant, a sludge of fallen leaves, a tangle of ivy, where the foxes made their homes and fallen angels stared up blindly, because he had an urge to talk to the poet. Nehemiah Trott was the poet's name, and his gravestone beneath the greenery read, "Here lies the mortal remains of Nehemiah Trott, poet, 1741 to 1774. Swans sing before they die." Bod said, "Master Trott, might I ask you for advice?" Nehemiah Trott beamed wanly. "Of course, brave boy. The advice of poets is the cordiality of kings. How may I smear unction on your... No, not unction. How may I give balm to your pain?" I'm not actually in pain. I just Well, there's a girl I used to know, and I wasn't sure if I should find her and talk to her, or if I should just forget about it. Nehemiah Trott drew himself up to his full height, which was less than Bod's, raised both hands to his chest excitedly and said, "Oh, you must go to her and implore her. You must call her your Terpsichore, your Echo, your Clytemnestra. You must write poems for her, mighty odes. I shall help you write them. And thus, and only thus, shall you win your true love's heart." "I don't actually need to win her heart. She's not my true love," said Bod. "Just someone I'd like to talk to." "Of all the organs," said Nehemiah Trott, "the tongue is the most remarkable, for we use it both to taste our sweet wine and bitter poison. Thus also do we utter words both sweet and sour with the same tongue. Go to her, talk to her." "I shouldn't." "You should, sir. You must. I shall write about it when the battle's lost and won. But if I unfade for one person, it makes it easier for other people to see me." Nehemiah Trott said, "Ah, list to me, young Leander, young hero, young Alexander. If you dare nothing, then when the day is over, nothing is all you will have gained." Good point. Bod was pleased with himself and glad he had thought of asking the poet for advice. Really, he thought, if you couldn't trust a poet to offer sensible advice, who could you trust? Which reminded him. "Mr. Trott," said Bod, "tell me about revenge." "Dish best served cold," said Nehemiah Trott. "Do not take revenge in the heat of the moment. Instead, wait until the hour is propitious. There was a Grub Street hack named O'Leary, an Irishman, I should add, who had the nerve, the confounded cheek, to write of my first slim volume of poems, a nosegay of beauty assembled for gentlemen of quality, that it was inferior doggerel of no worth whatsoever, and that the paper it was written on would have been better used as... No, I cannot say. Let us simply agree that it was a most vulgar statement." "But you got your revenge on him?" asked Bod, curious. "On him and on his entire pestilent breed. Oh, I had my revenge, Master Owens, and it was a terrible one. I wrote and had published a letter, which I nailed to the doors of the public houses in London where such low, scribbling folk were wont to frequent, and I explained that, given the fragility of the genius poetical, I would henceforth write not for them, but only for myself and posterity, and that I should, as long as I live, publish no more poems for them. Thus I left instructions that upon my death, my poems were to be buried with me, unpublished, and that only when posterity realized my genius, realized that hundreds of my verses had been lost. Only then was my coffin to be disinterred. Only then could my poems be removed from my cold, dead hand to finally be published to the approbation and delight of all. It is a terrible thing to be ahead of your time." "And after you died, they dug you up and they printed the poems?" "Not yet, no. But there is still plenty of time. Posterity is vast." "So that was your revenge?" "Indeed, and a mightily powerful and cunning one at that." "Yes," said Bod, unconvinced. "Best served cold," said Nehemiah Trott proudly. What would you like to know? I can just talk. I mean, are there hands? Oh, a hand there. Yes, somebody's bouncing. Yes, hello. the question is how many of my ideas do I come up with by myself, and how much am I influenced by what's going on around me and people around me? You don't exist in a vacuum. Very often, if you're going to try and figure out where you get ideas from, you get them from things happening, you get them from things people say. I've stolen so far 2 books from my kids, from things that they said. Mike, my son, who is now 25 and has a real job and everything, when he was about 3 or 4, I told him to go to bed. And he looked up at me furiously. And he said, I wish I didn't have a dad. I wish I had. And then you could see him trying to figure out what else you could have. And after a while he said, I wish I had goldfish. And I thought, what a great idea for a book. And wrote a book called The Day I Swapped My Dad for 2 Goldfish, because he got none of the royalties. And I took the idea of wolves in the walls from a nightmare that my daughter Maddie had, where I went upstairs and she was 4 years old and she was crying, and I said, what's wrong? And she said, there are wolves in the walls of our house, and they came out and they took over the house. And I said, I think that was just a dream. And she said, no, it wasn't. I can show you the place in the wallpaper they came out from. And that became the wolves in the walls. But what tends to happen with all of these things is something happens, something is said, something in the swirl of existence, and that you just sort of, you stop and you go, that's a story. A couple of weeks ago, I was in China, and I was wandering around a ruined temple in western China, this sort of land that was essentially an archaeological site now, where once upon a time there had been a whole temple complex, and now there were just sort of lumps of red earth, basically. And when the souvenir sellers by the gate saw me, I think I was the first tourist they'd seen in several weeks, and they ran and started setting up their souvenir tables and putting things on it, and fake antiques and the things that they have in corners of China. And there was a man, a woman, and a little baby. And when I was leaving, I thought, if I go and spend $10 on something there, that baby will get to eat for another couple of weeks, and they aren't seeing many tourists right now, so I'll go and do that. So I wandered over to the table, and I started looking at stuff and going, this is pretty much the usual stuff you see on tables in historic spots in China. And then the old man reached under the table and he pulled out a cardboard box, and with things in it wrapped in newspaper. And he started showing me what he had wrapped in newspaper, which were basically things that he'd found around the site that probably should have been handed over to archaeologists and hadn't been. He showed me some strings of money and some fossilized peach pits and a couple of things, and I wasn't really interested. So then he reached over and unwrapped the prize of his collection for me, which was the top half of a human arm bone that looked about 500 years old. It was possibly 1,000 years old. It was brown and old, but it was very obviously, essentially, a human elbow. And I looked at this, and I thought, A, I have no desire for a human elbow. B, you're technically not allowed to take anything older than 75 years out of the country, so even if I wanted it, I couldn't. And B, I think they'd probably be picky if I'm taking elderly body parts out. And I said no, and wound up buying a little piece of something that probably wasn't really jade, and walked away very happy. But the idea of this old man trying to sell an arm, or just really the big knobbly bit on the arm, and what would happen to the person who bought it, immediately, just started taking over little corners of my head. And when I wasn't doing anything else in China, I'd start asking people questions about, how you can get from one corner of China to another if you have no money, and what you do, because I already knew that whoever I had would be on the run. And it wasn't even the project that I went to China for. It was just this little side story that crept into my head because somebody tried to sell me an elbow. And that's where you get ideas from. Yes, you.
How much of what you do you not give into solipsism, or do you just sort of go into a room and...
Say that again louder.
Okay, sorry. Do you ever find yourself giving into solipsism just when you write? And what do you do to deal with it when you do?
It's... Actually, the biggest thing that keeps you, I think, from solipsism when you're writing is things like this. It's the knowledge that when you're going to go out on the road with a book, even though you're writing it for yourself, you're going to have to look out at 500 people staring up at you, and they're all going to read the book. And if the book turns into an exercise in navel gazing, they will all let you know. They won't really even be polite about it. It's actually one of the things about readers that is both the joy and the despair of authors, because the same reader who will say, "I loved American Gods," is the same reader who will say, "Couldn't stand a Nancy Boys. What the hell was going on with that one there?" Or vice versa. And I think mostly for me, the thing that keeps me going, keeps it from slipping, is caring about the characters. I care about what happens to them. I'm interested in them. I want to find out. The very first big project I ever did, which was Black Orchid, I carefully outlined. And I think that was the last thing I outlined, because it felt like everything else I did after that was painting by numbers. I was just going and filling in, and I would much rather find out what happens by writing it, which is very silly. Don't do that at home. At times, there was a point 3/4 of the way through this book where it felt like I jumped out of a plane and was hoping to knit a parachute before I hit the ground. But it is what keeps me going. And it's what makes the process of fiction a process of discovery for me, as much as for anyone else. Let's see, let's go over. Do we have mics running through?
Right here.
Or, okay. Yes.
Okay.
Over.
I listened to a Nancy Boy on tape, which was an astonishing experience, and I'm curious what it's like for an author to hear his words read by someone else, and how you think that affects your relationship with the reader.
Well, I'm very lucky, because what I tend to do is whenever I can, I do my audiobooks myself. And when I can't, I try and find the very, very best person to. And sometimes can't is because I want to hear somebody else. With the Nancy Boys, it was simply enlightened self-interest and possibly some kind of desire for survival. You've written a book and you're going, I have 4 little old Jamaican ladies in this and they all have to be different. I will get Lenny Henry to do it. And I think Lenny's reading of the Nancy Boys is actually my favorite version of the book. It was sort of written with his voice in the back of my head, and I love the way he reads it. With the Graveyard book, with most of the books, I get to do them myself, and I spend 3 or 4 days in a studio discovering exactly how much noise the human stomach can actually make when you are in a quiet studio and there's nothing else happening. And it's I love the audiobook experience. I think it's very different from equal but different kind of thing to the book itself, to reading the book. I have no patience with people who say the experience of a book is only visual. I think, didn't Harold Bloom say something about how nobody who hears a book can actually experience it properly? which I think is right up there with saying, well, obviously, and blind people who are reading it through Braille, it's even further removed, which is nonsense. You're getting words, you are getting, as a reader, you're getting the raw code, and you are building up in your head a wonderful three-dimensional thing. One of the things I love best about audiobooks when I do them is you don't ever get that phenomenon of just skipping over a sentence. You also don't get that thing that I tend to get toward the end of a book where I get so excited I speed. And it's not that I'm skipping anything, it's just suddenly I'm going 130 miles an hour through the book and the pages are zooming. And one of the things I like about audiobooks is everything keeps up at the same pace, even toward the end, even when you want to go, no, keep going, no, don't do that. Quickly, get to the top of the stairs, something's going to happen. But I love audiobooks. And I love the fact that technology has reinvented audiobooks. 8 years ago, there probably weren't going to be any more. You talk to audiobook publishers, and it was dying, and they were closing down, and they were almost done. And then the iPod and MP3 and things downloadable, and the audiobook is now a thriving, happy, wonderful little medium, which makes me incredibly happy. There, yes, you, young man. So the question is, which book have I most enjoyed writing and why? Oh, I think the book I most enjoyed writing was probably Good Omens, but and the why on that was because I wasn't doing it on my own. I had Terry Pratchett at the other end of the phone, and I wrote my bits to make Terry Pratchett laugh, and Terry was writing his bits to make me laugh, and we weren't famous or anything then. I mean, he wasn't Terry Pratchett and I wasn't Neil Gaiman. We were just these two blokes writing a book together that we weren't even sure that anybody was going to want to buy. But the experience of writing that was just an absolute delight from beginning to end, because I had an instant audience and I couldn't slack off for a minute, because if I did, Terry would have written another 2,000 words. So I had to keep up and I had to keep writing, and there was that moment of joy when I wrote the scene with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and the other 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And I phoned him up, I said, all right, listen to this. You know, it's just the sheer joy. So I think probably Good Omens, because it was just two people having a mad amount of fun. Everything else I think I've ever written, there's always a point 3/4 of the way through where doom and gloom and the conviction that I shouldn't be doing this and I should go and get a proper job. One that involves getting up at a sensible time in the morning and probably putting on a tie. It just sort of, there's always 2 or 3 weeks where I'm an absolute misery, and then suddenly it breaks through and the sun breaks through and I'm happy writing again. Over there, yes. Well, the one that I heard was, is there a difference between writing screenplays and graphic novels and books and movies? Which? Oh, when they ask for a treatment, is there a difference? I actually won't do treatments anymore. And I won't do treatments for movies, because then the process becomes writing a treatment that everybody likes and not writing a script that everybody likes. And you very often find that once you've written a treatment that everybody likes, that treatment generates a script that nobody likes. Because the treatment is not the thing. And I try, in all truth, to make my treatments for books, the proposals for books and for comics, just shorter and shorter. It will be essentially, I figure if I can't get it down on 2 pages and just give you an idea of the kind of thing that's going to happen and the characters and what it's going to feel like, you don't want a beat-by-beat outline in one of those things, and furthermore, people trust me. But I've got to that point after 25 years. I think the truth is that the times that I've been involved in writing treatments, especially movie treatments, it would have been less effort and less, I believe the technical term for it is thesaurus, to have simply written the script. I could have written it in the same time and had a different set of arguments than I would have been having with film people. How are we off for time? Are we done? Okay, last or? We're done. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.